This is Euroscopic, your weekly roundup of what happened, what's happening, and what might happen in and to Europe. In partnership with EU Observer, we bring you insights and reporting from their people on the ground across the European Union and beyond, plus interviews with European policymakers and analysts. I'm William Bluecroft, a journalist who writes the Germany Substack newsletter called The Schland.
And I am Martin Gack, author of Inconclusive Thoughts at Substack.
And we are coming to you today, Monday, June 17th, 2024, from Berlin, Germany. We are going to be discussing, of course, more fallout of European Union elections, peace and reconstruction summits on Ukraine, some new things about nuclear weapons, especially as they regard NATO. And we have two great interviews, one with Shada Islam, EU Observer, and she writes a lot about the impact of Gaza on European policy, politics, and those much spoken about liberal democratic values. And bringing her back from last week, Valentina Saini, EU Observer contributing reporter. She's going to be telling us more about Italy's ideas on something called differentiated autonomy. That and much more coming right up.
Hey Bill, how are you? How are things?
Well, things aren't good because we're not together at your kitchen this week, unfortunately. So that makes me sad. And that means there's no cacio e pepe or some equivalent tasty meal for me.
I did cook this week a Napolitan carnival lasagna, which has everything that you can find in your kitchen pretty much in it. Plus, of course, a homemade from scratch lasagna sheets. But mainly it has meatballs and eggs and ricotta and mozzarella and
so it's like a garbage leftover dish.
I will not respond to that.
This is common. That's how I cook. I usually cook by what in my refrigerator or in my shelves, my drawers are going bad soon. Do I need to make?
Interestingly enough, this is actually considered a very expensive dish. Because obviously it has a lot of premium products inside, and it's cooked really only around the period of Carnival. There is a version of this on my side of Italy, in Puglia, which is the Barese lasagna, but I favor the Napolitan one. So anyway, yeah, it's been...
Well, speaking of your side of Italy, you had some VIP guests spending some time quite close to where you have a home, isn't that right? Last week, a few days ago.
That's right. They were. I had unsolicited neighbors for a couple of days, including Biden, and we had the bad luck of also seeing Meloni go hang out in Puglia. It's better when she just stays in Rome, but there you go. So
I know you have to ask the Romans what they feel about that. If they think it's just as good when she's in Rome.
Lazio is a state of Italy known for some unpleasant political allegiances, including the Lazio football team. But in any case, yes.
Happy Euros, by the way. I don't know if you're following. I'm really trying to avoid it.
Not at all, and couldn't care less. This is my relation with football, has always been. This is why my Argentine passport was retired, and I was sent into exile. I hate football. I cannot stand sort of the looks of football. I don't really like at all the politics of football and the way that it resembles some of the things I dislike most about politics. But other than that, it's great.
Yeah. So getting back to the other sport, the sport of politics, so we had Biden, we had Meloni, we had Macron, we had the whole G7 all-stars showing up in your neck of the woods of Italy. I don't know. These things happen all the time, I feel like. Was there anything to talk about?
No, there was really not a lot other than sort of all sorts of expressions of good intentions and the confirmation that the G7 will continue, at least in word, to push for the liberation of Ukraine, the pooling of Russian assets in order to pay for some of the ammo and for some of the...
Right, or at least the interest payments on that money. I believe that was sort of the agreement. They're not going to pull the actual frozen assets, but the interest accruing on those assets they're going to be able to use, which is an interesting little workaround.
Well, the issue that they have is essentially that there is a lot of internal opposition, including Lagarde herself at the IMF. And the reason why there was such opposition is because there is a question about the legality, but there is a bigger question, which is about precedent. And I think that everybody has become painfully aware of the fact that the political heirs in both Brussels, but also in Washington could change radically and could actually make the seizure of assets much more risky game looking forward. So there was a lot of discussion about that. There were a lot of discussions about essentially help and participation and so on. There was not a lot of discussion about the Middle East or Gaza. In fact,
surprise, right?
Okay.
We don't talk about the war.
So in a very pretty little clip, Meloni was asked by an Al Jazeera reporter about Gaza and about the G7 making its position on Israel in Gaza known. And it really was incredible. I mean, you saw Meloni sulking, rolling her eyes, sucking her tongue as like a 15-year-old. And then just vomiting out this, we should not forget who started this, Hamas, 7th of October. So, I mean, essentially contributed nothing to the conversation, made no sort of clear or interesting statement considering the position, just sort of laid back on the sort of use, rinse, and reused line on Hamas and so on. And it's really quite strange because it also shows a disconnect, I think, between the foreign policy machine in Brussels, I mean, where Borrell has been very, very vocal about this, and the G7, which I think stands in a much more ambiguous relation. And this follows sort of on what Valentina told us last week. We'll have her today again. But Meloni might be asking for Borrell's position for a far-right alliance if she is to give her consent and vote for a second run of von der Leyen at the head of the Commission.
Well, if she needs it, right? I mean, von der Leyen might just squeak by being able to keep together a centrist coalition, including the Greens. And again, I never know where the Greens, given which country they represent, where they fall, center left, center right, centrist. Let's just say the Greens are a thing of their own. Given that the far right, yes, surged in European elections as largely predicted, but didn't quite have the takeover that many feared, there is some chance that von der Leyen can get a second term without having to do a deal with the proverbial European political devil and get by on centrist support as she's been able to, thus kind of deflating Meloni's power at Brussels. But I think the G7 summit was interesting in that it did come right on the heels of European elections with an emboldened Giorgia Meloni. But as we heard from Valentina last week, not quite as emboldened at the European level as she might have hoped, since although she did quite well, her party did quite well, the turnout was not great. So you can't really say that Meloni really has the will of the people behind her. She has the will of a small turnout behind her. Which is pretty normal that the most sort of politically agitated among us go out to vote while everyone who doesn't really give a damn kind of shrugs their shoulders and stays home and enjoys their Sunday. But it's very strange right now because we really don't know, going from G7 to kind of the EU, what it's going to happen, because it is a tale of two stories. It is a tale of two elections here, right? The far right did surge, but the center also held. But at the same time, where the center held is not where European power is, right? European power being in the biggest countries, Germany and France, is also where the far right has the most power, and Italy as well. And it's in mid-sized and smaller countries where the center and the center left held. So you're looking at a European Union that has centrist power, yes, but the biggest sources of that power, France, Germany, Italy, are actually tilting to the far right. So that's going to be a very weird dynamic, I think.
I mean, the one big question, I think, right now, obviously, is France, right? I mean, France remains sort of the all-encompassing issue, and it's really in early July where if we really see Macron fall brutally in the second round on the 9th of July, I believe, then 6th of July, actually. What we're
7th, Sunday the 7th. Wait, it's the end of, yeah. It's coming up quick. Either way, it's coming up quick.
I can continue trying different dates and see if I actually get it. But so what we're going to see is that if my supposition is that if Macron really gets a very massive beating, and there was at least one poll going around saying that it might be a complete wipeout in which Macron's party is reduced to 3 seats in the Assemblée Nationale, and that would actually come from extraterritorial constituencies, so nothing inside the hexagon, then it is likely that Macron will not be able to, hold on to power. I mean, he would have to basically call to general elections. I think it would be a very strange thing if he really finds himself in a sort of absolutely irrelevant minority, but he decides to, stay in the Elysee. That said,
much like Olaf Scholz, right? That's exactly Olaf Scholz's position right now. He really has no standing in Germany or the European Union, given how poorly his party is performing in Germany and how poorly it performed at the European level, along with his green allies. He also has no real standing, but he is holding on.
Right. I think that this would have been akin to, Scholz going for a total suicidal pact with Macron and actually calling a national election immediately after finding himself with 14%. But the thing about France that makes it a bit of a particular animal is that, the AfD would be unlikely to actually climb into Germany, whereas the FN looks actually completely set for a win if they actually were into national elections, as of right now at least. And that would actually mean Bardella, who is the toy boy of Le Pen, essentially becoming president of France.
Here's the big difference between France and Germany. Two big things. First of all, France, the one upset that could be, Macron might get wiped out, that's true. But Marine Le Pen, there could be a spoiler chance of this left-wing coalition that's kind of rising out of its own grave, to try to challenge Le Pen. And now I'm not necessarily hopeful because we've seen where center-left and left-wing politics have gone around the European Union, with the exception of places like Spain. But if anything is going to recharge a left-wing spirit, a left-wing movement in France or anywhere else in Europe, it's not going to be the centrists. It's going to be a right-wing challenge. And that's what we have right now. So there could be, what I'm interested in seeing in France is not how well Macron does, because we know that he's weak. It's will voters respond to, and will this new left-wing alliance in France actually be able to make a dent and steal back some of these voters from Le Pen? Unlike in Germany, where the left is dead, right? France has a long history of socialist and left-wing sort of politics, where Germany does not. I mean, of course, the East, but the East is a whole different beast when it comes to the idea of left-wing politics. And right now, Germany's, like, from a German political establishment point of view, the best answer that Germany has to the AfD is let's just ban them, which I find very funny considering how much the Greens get slammed for this suspicion of trying to ban things like banning cars, banning nuclear power, this kind of stuff. But Germans across the political establishment love to ban things. So that's not going to go down well, as if, like, okay, you ban the AfD, you can't ban the voters, and you can't ban voters, what's in voters' heads. So I find the Germany and French comparison sort of ends there.
I think the question is one that holds all the way across Europe, to be honest. I mean, I do believe that essentially what you're describing stands at the very core of the discussion, because one of the possibilities for Brussels is not only to try to find a broad coalition for von der Leyen that moves her closer to the Greens, but actually try to bring into the fold the socialists. And you have very viable socialist projects right now, in Spain for one, where, the far right really continues to poll. I mean, they're very noisy, Vox, but they're still well under 10%. So they're essentially an irrelevant machine. I mean, you have seen sort of the PP, which is the center-right, even a very confused center-right and not very apt, but a center-right, which has actually captured most of the right-wing vote. Not so in France. Not so, I mean, in Holland during the national elections, but certainly in Germany, where, the right is what took the vote. The AfD was very powerful, but still the CDU-CSU machine is the one that dominated. I think that what is actually of interest is a question as to who von der Leyen will go out to shop around with. And obviously there is a possibility of imagining a Brussels where people that are truly concerned about the preservation of European values and European democracy and the European rule of law will band together, not just with the Greens, but will go to the Socialists and try to form a broad coalition. If that's the case, then I think that the cordon sanitaire against the far right will hold.
Yeah, I find it so interesting, this whole, the rhetoric surrounding the cordon sanitaire, or Brandmauer, as we call it in Germany, the firewall against the far right. And as I said in our episode last week, it's kind of, first of all, it's unclear what is on the other side of the firewall when, at least in a German context, in many other European countries as well, all the other parties are kind of starting to sound like the far right anyway, in one way, shape, or form. So what are you actually preserving or protecting against? The other thing that comes to mind is an Instagram post I saw just ahead of elections. Now, granted, it came from the spokesperson of a left-wing party here in Germany, so obviously they have their own ideological bias. But nonetheless, the post made a good point, which is basically, centrists say, it was criticizing centrist politics, saying centrists say, democracy is all about compromise. And then so the leftists say, okay, we'll compromise with us on the left. And then the centrists say, no, that's extremism. We'll never do that. And so then they instead lurch to the right. Now, taking all that sort of ideological bias, for granted for a moment, but putting that aside, there is a point there to be made that despite all of this talk and all of the hot air that's talked about, trying to keep the far right out. You hear this from center-left, centrist parties, the Greens, liberal parties in general. Ultimately, though, in real life, tacheles, there's actually a much bigger willingness to adopt the talking points and the policy points of the far right than to have anything to do with the far left. And I find that phenomenon, that discrepancy between the rhetoric versus what we actually see in politics happening, fascinating and also a kind of troubling.
I think that the point goes even farther as far as I'm concerned, which is that not only there is a reluctance to actually lurch towards extreme left, which one would say, okay, fair enough. I think that there is even a reluctance of any sorts to lurch to the left altogether. So, as you see sort of the baseline of very center-leaning socialism, social democrats essentially take positions in foreign policy, for instance, against the continuation of the war in Ukraine, against Israel in the bombing of Gaza, clearly against sort of American influence on sort of agri-industrial systems in wherever you look at it. This is not really a fringe position. So I think that the division of the waters there has become a lot more trenchant. I think that what is worth pointing out is that the problem of the pandering, not just lurching, but the problem of pandering to the far right, particularly in the von der Leyen environment, has produced some very, very bitter fruits, right? What we have seen only a couple of days ago, I encourage all our listeners to go read the article on the EU Observer, it's human rights organizations essentially demanding that the European Union, particularly obviously the Commission, puts strong binding conditions for the transference of money to countries in the basin of the Mediterranean, because the money that is going to Egypt, to Tunisia, to anybody else that kind of joins a fray of outsourcing migration repression in the guise of the Meloni political project, essentially getting a blank check for some of the worst practice in terms of all the things that supposedly the European Union holds sacred. Human rights, the right of people to so on and so forth. So that on the one hand. On the other hand, we have, I think, what is a bigger one now that sort of Politico published, which is that the Commission, von der Leyen apparently suppressed a report which essentially castigates Meloni's Italy, for all sorts of things, but particularly for media freedom. This is actually really quite telling, because what we have is Meloni, essentially doing the bidding of the far right in the worst of its traditions, vitiating public media and appointing her people, attacking the courts, attacking basic rights, and then von der Leyen from the top of the Commission in Brussels giving her cover. right?
Yeah.
So obviously, when you see that, if you think about the position of, say, even ALDE, right? Forget the left, even the liberals in Brussels, what kind of appetite could they have to actually try to help von der Leyen to continue her work, right? She's liable, as is Manfred Weber and the EPP, which gave a home to Orban for many years, to essentially just, playing at for convenience sake, to bring neo-fascists and people of the kind into the fold.
Right. And as you point out, many of these people are highly skeptical of supporting Ukraine, if not outright pro-Russian. So it's like, what are these people doing, right? They're completely undermining, forget about like liberal values and all these kind of these warm and fuzzy ideas, but like their own politics, right? Their own party platforms, they are undermining by allying themselves with people that are against what they believe in, right? Pro-NATO, right? We just had a NATO summit also last week with the G7, at the same time, but roughly the same time the G7 was taking place. At the same time, we have new reports from the CIPRI arms control think tank out of Stockholm, putting out yet another report about the rise in nuclear weapons and the rise of weapons overall and military spending overall. And I mean, NATO talking really seriously about more nuclear weapons.
Indeed. I mean, there is now sort of a straight-out call from Stoltenberg, which was published yesterday by The Telegraph. They're actually talking about deploying more nuclear weapons. And this is happening basically as everybody else is sort of involved in all kind of political discussions, which do not seem to address very fundamental issues. Right. I mean, so now the discussion is really about all of a sudden is shifting again towards an almost mid-20th century approach to the defense of Europe. So we're hearing about conscription in the CDU in Germany. In the US, I mean, you might have heard that there was actually an amendment passed for a 2025 all-encompassing conscription record to be taken, so people will be essentially brought into the record automatically. I mean, I think you're right. The basic problem that I continue to see is very large populations of political orphans that do not have sort of clear conduits to represent their interests and concerns. And I do insist that most of them are actually economic concerns, but very clearly they go beyond that. So here we are with Valentina Zaini once again. She was accompanying us last week to talk about the European elections, and now we have her here to talk about Italian politics. Hi, Valentina.
Hi there, Martin. Hi, William. Thank you for having me.
So at some point late last week, I began to saw images that I thought were coming out of the Hong Kongese parliament in the 80s. Turns out that it was actually the Italian parliament, where parliamentary members of parliament were beating each other up. I mean, it was just sort of a massive brawl. It turns out that Dono, a parliamentarian for the Movimento 5 Stelle, the Five-Star Movement, ended up in the hospital. And then, of course, all of Italian media went in overdrive from Ms. Gruber to Travaglio. Everybody was on screen explaining what had happened. So the fight, to which we will get into in a minute, happened around a discussion on what Italy is calling differentiated autonomy, autonomia differenziata. And I was wondering if you would be kind enough for all of us to explain what is this differentiated autonomy.
Yes, of course, Martin. The so-called autonomia differenziata is a reform that, if approved, will deeply redefine the territorial administrative organization of Italy, which is currently divided into 20 regions. And, it make it resemble Spain, which is divided into comunidades autónomas. The reform is based on the so-called Calderoli draft law, which basically defines the mechanisms through which Italy's regions will be able to demand more competencies, so basically more management powers, in 23 areas such as healthcare, education, the environment, foreign trade, ports, and energy. The main sponsor of the reform it's important to say that, is the far-right party Lega, which is part of the coalition currently governing Italy. And the roots of this project go back to the early 90s, when the then Lega Nord used to call for the secession of what he used to call Padania. So autonomia differenziata is something of a fixation for their constituency, especially in Veneto and Lombardy, which are the two strongholds of the party. They are two northern regions. So, according to Lega, this reform would make the whole country more efficient and modern, and bridge the gap between the north, which is wealthier, and the south, which, generally speaking, is poorer. This, however, is not so evident to many people, including professors of constitutional law and economists from all over the country, some regional governors, the opposition parties, and also the polls. I mean, if we look at the latest poll, one has been published today on Repubblica, 45% of Italians are opposed to the reform. 20% don't actually know what they think about it, probably because there's been a lack of information about what this reform consists in and what its consequences would be. And only 35% are favorable, okay? So this is also important. According to the critics, there are many risks. For starters, the gap between the North and the South would actually get worse. Each region might end up legislating in its own way on many issues, which would cause more bureaucracy and inefficiency. And then respected experts say that the reform could jeopardize the financial stability of Italy, which already has a huge public debt, and it would make Italy even more divided and vulnerable to crisis at a time of chaos in the Mediterranean and Europe.
So if you can talk a bit more about the economic disparity, I mean, there is already in place some form of differentiated autonomy, right? There are a couple of regions, especially in the north, that benefit from this. Sicily has a somewhat similar kind of similar situation, but it is true that the economic difference or the economic inequality between north and south is quite stark in many cases, and there is a strong argument that this would actually make the situation considerably worse. Can you explain why?
Well, okay, the differences between northern Italy and southern Italy, the causes of this are, of course, huge, very complex, and they have an historical basis, which would be quite difficult to explain in right now. But we can say that 5 regions of Italy already have quite an autonomy. Okay, they have a statuto that actually regulates their autonomy. They are more autonomous than others on many competencies. This has historic reasons, as you were saying. Like, for example, Sicily is one of them. Trentino Alto Adige in the extreme north is another one of them. When you look at these 5 regions, however, you can see that there are huge differences between the results of this autonomous statuto status, because in some parts you have quite good administrative regions that are administered quite well. In other places, you don't have such a good administration. Like, for example, if we look at Sicily, it's difficult to compare the quality of the administration there with the one of, for example, Trentino Alto Adige in the north. Although, of course, Trentino Alto Adige also has its flaws, okay? What is important to say here is that this special status has not actually created a model that could be imported to the rest of Italy. So experts are saying here, and critics are saying here, okay, if one region finds the perfect recipe for efficiency, for attracting foreign investments, why don't we do that for the whole country? Why don't we make this model of a better organization worth for the whole country. This is a critic. This is what critics are saying.
So all this sounds very technical, very interesting. I mean, especially if you have spent time sort of looking at disparities in economic income. But why the punching fist in the parliament? I mean, this does not jump to the eye or to the ear as something that would have people out in arms in the middle of a parliamentary session beating each other up.
Well, Martin, because tensions are really quite high at the moment. This could be the decisive week for this reform, and there are many people who are really concerned about it. This week the law could be passed by the Chamber of Deputies. It could be amended, in which case it should go back to the Senate and then go back to the Chamber of Deputies, or it could also be ignored, like no further discussion about it for the time being. Okay, so the opposition has already called for a rally on Tuesday, I'm looking at the organizations and parties and associations, summing up, and it could be quite huge. Even the Italian Episcopal Conference, the Conference of Italian Bishops, expressed serious concern about this reform. So what happened last week in the parliament is a sign that tensions are quite high, and it is also a sign, if I may say, of how some parties of the ruling coalition deal with dissent, because the guy from Movimento 5 Stelle, which is of course an opposition party, so it is opposed to this reform, he was just trying to give an Italian flag to Minister Calderoli, who is the author of the draft law. He's a long-standing member of Lega. And this gesture was like a symbol to remind everyone of the importance of national unity, that very national unity that, according to critics and experts, could be jeopardized if this reform was actually approved. And this person, he was stopped by the employees of the Chamber of Deputies, but he was immediately and needlessly rounded up by some member of parliaments of Lega and Fratelli d'Italia, and he got a punch in the chest, so he collapsed on the floor. And by the way, also one of the employees of the Chamber of Deputies got hurt, so he went to the medical ward of the parliament, which of course is very unfortunate. So yes, there's a big deal of people who are really concerned about this. As I told you before, polls are also showing that only 35% of Italians are in favor, and many are starting to ask themselves why would Meloni's party Fratelli d'Italia and Forza Italia, which saw their support a bit eroded in the south during the European election, precisely because they support this reform. Why are they continuing to support this reform? And just to say that, this is not only politicians this is not only concern expressed by opposition parties, also organizations like the European Commission in 2023 expressed concern about this reform. They wrote, I quote, "Overall, the reform risks jeopardizing the government's ability to steer public spending. This could have a negative impact on the quality of Italy's public finances and on regional disparities." So this is a very sensitive matter here.
Valentina, you started to answer that question, like what does this mean for Giorgia Meloni as she tries to consolidate power and become a real power broker and power player at the European level? So, yeah, to that question you kind of posed rhetorically, why is she on board with this? Why isn't she trying to stop this? It seems like it's a threat to her own power, especially at the European level.
Yeah, William, I mean, according to common sense, she has more reasons not to support this reform than to support it, okay? It is a reform that is giving strength to the Democratic Party, the main opposition party, in an important part of Italy. Its approval would greatly strengthen Matteo Salvini, the leader of Lega, who is not an easy partner to govern with. And if we look at the EU, where she keeps saying she wants an important role for Italy, well, we just read what the European Commission wrote in May 2023 about this reform. The thing is that, according to many analysts and also to the Democratic Party, the fate of the reform on differentiated autonomy is closely linked to another reform that Meloni cares very much about. This reform is the so-called premierato, which basically consists of the direct election of the prime minister by the electorate and the prevention of the creation of any possible future technical government, like technical governments like those of Mario Draghi or Mario Monti, who, with all their faults, played an important role in securing Italy's public finances in difficult phases for the country. So, according to the Democratic Party Secretary Elly Schlein, this constitutional reform will disrupt the institutional balance and drain the powers of the President of the Republic. And according to the opposition, through this constitutional reform, Meloni wants to make a new Hungary out of Italy and follow the example of Viktor Orban. This reform, is a constitutional reform, as I said, so it will take longer to be approved. It needs a much longer progress, while the autonomia differenziata, this is the decisive week. And as we know in politics, you give today if you're quite sure to receive today or tomorrow, not in 1 year time.
So basically, Meloni going along with something she might not like and actually might be bad for her in hopes of getting something that she is in favor of, and would sort of trading. It's a trade-off basically for her.
Yes, but I also have to say, William, that we are seeing some divisions in the majority right now, in the coalition governing Italy right now, these very days. Political members of Forza Italia and Fratelli d'Italia are saying these days that they probably we should take more time, we should go a bit slower. They say that it's because of the incident that happened at the Chamber of Deputies with the punch given to the guy, the Donno from Movimento 5 Stelle. But actually, they are also thinking about those results of the European election that saw, apart from a low turnout in the South, they saw the South voting for the Democratic Party, which is opposed to this reform.
So if I could just very quickly play Avocado Diavolo, the devil's advocate, as we like to say, the European Union is at its heart is a decentralized system. It's about this balance between supranational regulations at Brussels that then get interpreted and applied in regional ways. So what is the difference between that idea of letting different parts of the European Union, administer themselves as they see fit? What's the difference between that European ideal and what is being proposed here in Italy, this differentiated autonomy?
That's a very nice question, William. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, we have to say that it's a matter of dimension, I would say. A macro European region is not the same that an Italian region, of course, in terms of dimension, in terms of population. If we think that, for example, northern eastern region Veneto, which is very strong in exports, gets the competence on foreign trade and starts talking to China, for example, what would be its negotiation power in front of a superpower like that? That's impossible. Also, many experts and analysts and also many political parties and many people think that the European Union should go towards a direction of more integration rather than more division. They are talking about a federation. People here, some parties here, they base their campaign for the European election on the slogan United States of Europe. United States of Europe. So many people want more integration. What is the what would be the benefit, or further dividing, creating more bureaucracies, creating more local legislations. Life is already enough difficult as it is for entrepreneurs wanting to, export. And for example, if this reform was approved, this could also mean that a company, an Italian company, if it has more seats, it has the main seats in one region, but more seats in other parts of the country, they should respect different kind of legislations depending on the regions where they are based. I mean, it's not easy to see that this will be, really a huge obstacle for competitiveness, and also to attract foreign investments.
Valentina, there is also the fact that autonomia differenziata was sort of a bit of the conditions that the Lega, Salvini, put to Meloni to form coalition. And there is at least some talk, I have heard this week, Travaglio and a few others, mentioning the fact that were Meloni not to push it through and really try to get the legislation approved, the threat could be that Salvini and the Lega exit the coalition, thus making essentially the government fall and sort of, ushering new elections. I mean, it would be perhaps even more of an earthquake were that to happen than Macron going completely crazy in the middle of the night after the elections. What do you think? I mean, can you talk a bit to that, and what do you think the chance of that happening are?
I mean, the chances, I really don't know, because in Italy, everything could happen. But what we say, if we look at the rational picture, okay, Lega did not have a good result in this European election. Do they really want to go to the polls right now? Do they really want to go to an election right now? And also, there are divisions in the Lega, which is normally a very united country. Party. What we saw in the electoral campaign for the European election, however, has been a Lega which has been quite divided. Okay, there were voices against the choice by Salvini to candidate Generale Vannacci, for example. Many people were against that. That Umberto Bossi, one of the founders of this party, voted against Lega at the European election. So the party is not at a time, and its leader, most of all, is not going through a time when they are strong enough, I think, to go to an election. Also, the junior party of the coalition, Forza Italia, gained more strength, and so this could also be, an element, because Forza Italia is center-right, so they could actually start talking to the centrist forces that exist in the Italian parliament. What I can tell you for sure is that Meloni is decided to go through all this, all her term. She said many times that she wants to go all through this term. We know that Italy has suffered for years of government instability, in the sense that governments can fall and then reform. She wants to govern through all 5 years and possibly later. So this is also an element that we should all take into account, as well as the bad moment that the Lega party is going through.
I'm just trying to think of all the snap elections happening across the European Union and Europe more broadly, and to throw Italy onto that list would be a fun couple of months, especially for us in the media covering it. One thing, Valentina, and I don't know if you can answer this, and I don't want you to speculate, so feel free to just say no or I don't know, and we can move on. But something that came to my mind in your previous answer when I asked you about regionalization, and you said that, what would a tiny region of Italy have, up against China, for example? And that made me think that this kind of idea of further splitting up and dividing up Italy, which is a fairly substantial country in the European Union, is actually very much in the interest of a country like China and an interest in a country like Russia, maybe even the United States. Is there any evidence of any kind of machinations in the background of Chinese or Russian influence that's kind of promoting or pushing this idea of differentiated autonomy as a way of further weakening Italy as a country and the EU more broadly as a bloc?
Well, William, thank you very much for that question because it's very interesting. What we have evidence about is that, for example, the Russians, they were influencing the process of in 2017 when we saw that those crazy weeks when, the Catalonia autonomous community in Spain was asking for independence to the national government in Madrid, and they actually ended up self-proclaiming their independence. And this has social, economic, and political consequences still today, 7 years after it happened, almost 7 years. So we have evidence that Russia tried to influence that process, and it did. We know that foreign powers like Russia, for example, always tries to influence the electoral processes in democratic nations and in the European Union, in the United States, for example. So I don't know about China, but there is no reason not to think that a superpower might actually think, okay, this is a great chance to further divide my opponents in the international geopolitical arena. So why don't you do that? Why wouldn't they? That would certainly be in their interest to have a weaker European Union, and so this will be one way, certainly. And also, as I said before, the economic performance of Italy, and therefore of the European Union, because Italy, as you said, is a fairly important country in the European Union, could be seriously jeopardized by this reform.
There was a very strong lead on the presence of Russian money in the Lega, right? I mean, the Savoini affair, which was never really clarified.
Right. Yes, I forgot to mention that. Yes, also.
So, Valentina Zaini, thank you very much. Wherever I find Italians, my heart is immediately warm. So our main discussion for this week is a topic that most have forgotten somehow, with all the brouhaha to the east and to the west and to the north and to the south. Ukraine. Ukraine is back at the top of the agenda. Zelensky has been parading around Europe, and he was just in Switzerland for the peace conference of sorts, although without Russia. So, Bill, what do you have on it?
Yeah, one wonders these events must be timed intentionally, right? I mean, we had the so-called Reconstruction Conference in Berlin, immediately followed by this so-called Peace Conference in Switzerland, which, as we're recording, is still going on, so we don't know exactly what's going to come out of it. And of course, these were planned knowing full well that the European elections will have just taken place, and there'll be a whole new sort of setting of the table in Europe, and it was sort of reinvigorate, as you say. Like, I don't think it's fair to say Ukraine's been forgotten, but it's kind of just sort of fallen into the cosmic radiation background of European politics as the war rages on. And for, of course, people in Ukraine, it's still a deadly and devastating situation, especially for troops on the front. And things are not looking great, right, for Ukraine, given sort of the production issues and the supply issues and all of the political dallying in Western countries. And, the reconstruction, for me, the big question, and the number one question is, how do we, first of all, is there any point of talking about reconstruction of Ukraine when this war has no end in sight, and Russia will continue attacking infrastructure, critical infrastructure, city centers, etc., all the things that you would be rebuilding? And the second thing is, of course, how do you make sure that Ukraine really gets built and it's not just Western companies that get to have a nice lump sum of money sent their way, like we saw, for example, in Iraq, where all of the George Bush administration, Dick Cheney friends got some lucrative contracts, and Iraq still had blackouts, still didn't have reliable electricity supply for a decade or whatever it was. I don't think the question is how do big Western companies not get a piece of the pie. I think they're, of course, going to get a piece of the pie, just like weapons manufacturers are getting a huge piece of the pie now. That's kind of par for the course. The question is, how do they get a piece of the pie and actually apply that piece to substantive help and assistance for the people who need it in Ukraine? I think the criticism of, sort of the anti-capitalist criticism of these countries just enriching themselves is a little bit unfair. Of course, they're going to enrich themselves, but is it going to happen with actually some good being done at the end? The objective being rebuilding Ukraine. But what was unclear to come out of this conference, aside from the massive transportation issues and commuting issues that happened in Berlin with Zelensky in town due to security for him, the big question that didn't really get answered, of course, because it's a bit premature, is what does that look like? What does that reconstruction look like? It was a lot of elbow rubbing at this conference, a lot of speeches and presentations about what things could look like, but very much in the conditional sense. Not really anything concrete that we can say because the war is still going on. And that's just the reconstruction, not to get to the peace conference, which, as you point out, Russia is not there. China is not there, protesting the fact that there's no one from Russia. And I do understand not having Russia there because Russia doesn't seem to be much in the mood for peace, but you can't really make peace with yourself. You make peace with your enemies.
I think that's a very fair point. I mean, there are two things about reconstruction that continue to strike me and became quite relevant and visible this week. The first one is that Ukraine has a very serious, deep-running, unresolved problem with corruption. And as you're pointing out, this is usually very fertile grounds for very unsavory business dealings of the kind that we indeed saw in Iraq, for one thing. So what we're facing is, once again, not only the fact that, crony capitalism can actually produce massive revenues for American and European companies, but there are also a lot of people sitting inside Ukraine in very ambiguous positions that actually also stand to benefit from this, with the potential of creating an oligarchic mafia sort of state, right? Because the kind of money that will be moved in for the reconstruction, essentially, of an entire country, give or take a couple of square miles, in the conditions in which institutions are not solid enough to actually filter and make the movement of that money transparent, it's really an invitation to complete sort of institutional, disaster. That on the one hand. The second question, and I think this to me is really the big one, is why would it not be just Russian money? Why would this be not at the top of the agenda, essentially seizing assets to the extent that, you broke it, you fix it? I mean, I don't think that there is anything, I don't think that there is any defense of Russia that I find at all convincing. I mean, none. But I think that usually it's the very strange place in which people that usually agree with me that Russia cannot be excused seem to actually pull back and say, well, it doesn't necessarily need to be Russia that pays for this. It doesn't necessarily be, I mean, I don't want to draw the immediate parallel, but it doesn't necessarily need to be Israel that pays for, the reconstruction of Gaza. And the question is, well, why anybody else, really? Why would anybody else's taxes in countries that are already hard-pressed very often for reinvestment in infrastructure, in education, so on and so forth? And I'm not talking here about, the global south. I'm talking about here Europe, where the economic situation has been compromised. Why is it that it's not Russia that will pay for what they destroyed in Ukraine? And there is no obvious answer to this. I think that as for the peace conference, it is incredible to me. I mean, that conversation happening with all these, hundreds of people, I mean, sitting around the table as Ukraine essentially began to conduct operations inside Russia. I mean, it's only 5 days now, or 6 days, since we really have full deployment. I think 3 days ago there were 80 Ukrainian drone hits inside Russian territory. So what we're seeing on the ground, the theater, is actually really a massive escalation, perhaps not in terms of intensity, but most certainly in terms of geostrategy. I mean, Russia has only been hit sort of here and there, but there has not been consistent effort on Russian territory. Many things seem to indicate that that will change because missiles have also been employed to hit Russian land. So, against the backdrop of all this talk of, hope and reconstruction and peace, the reality seems to actually be indicating something very, very different.
Right. And of course, you're dealing with a partner, a potential peace partner that can't be trusted, right? Russia came out and said, well, we will end operations in exchange for a pledge that Ukraine will never join NATO. But there's no reason to ever trust Russia on that. I mean, because of the Budapest Memorandum, right? Russia already reneged on its commitments to protect and not interfere in Ukrainian sovereignty in exchange for giving up the nuclear weapons back in the 90s after the Cold War. So there's just this is the problem. There's just no trust. I see no good outcome here. Like on one hand, the war cannot go on forever. There needs to be some kind of resolution, but that resolution cannot be essentially Ukraine being subservient to Russia, and Russia can't be trusted with any kind of deal it might sign. So I don't see how we get out of this. It's really very, very troubling. And yeah, this idea, I also find it funny, just as a side note, this peace conference taking place in Switzerland, Switzerland, the so-called neutral country that doesn't want to get involved in anything, but they're happy to have this performative gathering to talk about peace in Ukraine.
No, the theatrics of it are great. I mean, I think that the problem that you have with Russia, generally speaking, is that it has forced a lot of the global balance of power to sort of slide back into this. We have essentially moved into the space of the best possible solution is a negotiated solution because actually the status quo was broken. So, you can basically right now walk into any country, kill a couple of 100,000 people, destroy like infrastructure and so on, then sort of sit back, raise the flag and say, well, let's sit down and talk. It becomes essentially a dynamic of a mafia dynamic. And I think in this sense, I mean, I am certainly not a hawk, but I'm of the opinion that Russia has to pay for this, not only economically, but really all sorts of geopolitical privileges will have to actually go. I'm not, I'm looking at a lot of the left and a lot of the far right commentary, and it's essentially pro-Russian. I mean, they can hardly disguise the fact that they, every single time that Russia takes over town or like advances 1 kilometer in one direction or another, there is this glee. And, to me, this is very, very off-putting because it actually sort of talks about broad segments of our political population that really see this form of brute force as viable. And I understand that for a lot of them, it's really the enemy of my enemy because, there is this distrust for the US and then there is this distrust for sort of the von der Leyen type of politics in the EU. Okay, I mean, that's fair enough. But I think that, we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. Or if you prefer, the enemy of my enemy, it's not always my friend. And this kind of confusion, this sort of enjoyment of sticking it to them, it's not only politically asinine, it's not cretinous, but the imbecility also sort of turns into a question as to what is political and geopolitical health for Europe.
Yeah, indeed. I think this virulent and quite legitimate in many cases anti-Americanism and anti-NATOism that then turns into pro-Russia, like as you say, walk and chew gum at the same time. You can have very legitimate criticisms for U.S. policy and its use of NATO to extend its power in the world, for sure. But that doesn't mean you also then have to be on Russia's side or have Ukraine pay for the ills of the United States, foreign policy for the last 60, 70, 80 years, whatever. And I feel like people who really do have Ukraine's interests at heart and want to see Russia out of Ukraine, they would be helped if they made clear the difference between Ukrainian defense and a proxy war against Russia. I think a lot of that criticism comes from this sense that actually Ukraine, what is a legitimate war of defense, is being turned into an illegitimate proxy war against Russia. And we've heard this from US and Western leaders, where they actually want to use Ukraine to weaken Russia, which seems rather stupid, to weaken a country and destabilize a country with thousands of nuclear weapons. Doesn't seem like a very smart idea, for as unsavory as Vladimir Putin is, there's even more unsavory people behind him who would gladly take his place. And I feel like if there's more work done at the political level and at the rhetorical level, making a very strong line between helping Ukraine defend itself versus trying to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, you might be able to win some broader support beyond the center on the left and the right, and sort of quell some of that, very anti-American, anti-Western, anti-NATO sentiment that, as you say, is both on the extremer sides of the left and the right.
On that note, we have a great interview coming up.
Joining us now on Euroscopic is Shada Islam. She's an independent EU commentator and analyst based in Brussels, and she is a columnist for EU Observer. Shada, so thank you so much for joining us on Euroscopic this week.
Thank you very much for having me.
Shada, let's start with, the European elections, first of all. Nice and broad. What were kind of your big takeaways? You cover a lot, you write a lot about the political and moral implications of what's going on in Gaza. So from that perspective, give us your view of what came out of European elections.
So for me, William, of course, the big story is the rise of the far right in some of our very important European Union member states. I know the conventional wisdom in Brussels is that the center is holding because the European Parliament majority will still be the conservative right group, the European People's Party, followed by the Socialists and Democrats. But the overall story for me, which is very frightening given its moral repercussions and the amount of racism, ethno-nationalism, and xenophobia we can expect, is the rise of the far right in so many countries, and especially in France, where Emmanuel Macron, the president, has called snap elections, which is a risky business because we could end up with a cohabitation or the simultaneous sort of being in power of centrists, which is Macron, but also a far right rising star, which is Bardella. So risky there, and also the rise of the AfD, which is clearly a neo-Nazi party in Germany. And of course, we have the wonderful Geert Wilders with all his anti-Islam rhetoric in the Netherlands. Austria too, far-right resurgent. So I'm extremely worried. It has enormous repercussions also on the European Union's moral status across the world, especially in the global south. And of course, none of the parties that I've mentioned to you have any sympathy for the Palestinian cause. So we can expect even more hardline policies when it comes to the Middle East, and even more support for Israel, which is obviously a contravention of very important international conventions on human rights and international law. So very worrying indeed, William.
So, Shada, can you see Macron stepping down if in the second round he really were to get a beating? And do you think, that in order to essentially try to secure himself another run in the Elysée, he would actually move to look for, try to steal votes from the right, try to sort of position Renaissance in a more of a right-wing angle in order to see if he can capture some of the votes he has now lost to the Rassemblement National.
So, one of the things that is very, very significant is how the far right, the extreme right, the hard right, the radical right, whatever you want to call it, how it's been normalized. It's been normalized and mainstreamed by current politicians like Emmanuel Macron, like Ursula von der Leyen, and, many across Europe have done that. In France already, Martin, if you are looking at how minorities feel, Muslims and black and brown people, the restrictions on freedom of expression, especially when it comes to Gaza, freedom of assembly when it comes to Gaza, the keffiyeh is banned, carrying the Palestinian flag is banned. You can't even, in private, be talking about certain issues. People are being very careful. And, the whole sort of rhetoric that Macron has embraced from Marine Le Pen, who is the leader of the national rally, the Rassemblement National, the far-right group, on Islam and Islamophobia, on xenophobia, etc., has been happening over the years. I've been warning about it. I've been writing about it for several years. So as we go forward towards the elections, I would not be surprised if many of the things that the far right has been saying about foreigners, sending them home, the great so-called replacement theory, etc., I would not be surprised. I hope he doesn't do so. I wish he wouldn't do so, but I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't do it. Some of his allies do, that they embrace that framing of foreigners as being unwanted, and especially Muslims as being unwanted in today's France. But we're going to see how these alliances, these parties shape up, what they're going to be doing. Will the left, unite across a progressive message for France, or will they be disunited as they are at the moment? Will the conservatives, will the centrists, the Republicans actually, go ahead and embrace the far right, as some of them have said they will? So it's all out there to play. Let's watch very carefully and then see what happens.
Shada, I like how you bring in sort of what Muslim minority here, how they're being affected, other people of color being affected across the European Union by a lot of these policies, a lot of these very xenophobic and ethno-national policies. Where do you see as the potential political or electoral impact? If we look at the United States, Palestinian and Arab American voters actually could pose a big challenge to Joe Biden in the U.S. election. That's in the United States. Do you see similar political impact, political influence among these kinds of communities in the European Union, or is it a different kind of political phenomenon?
That is a very, very important question. And to tell you the truth, I've been asking myself that as well. So all my friends and I would say family in the United States have made it very clear to me in messages, etc., that whatever happens, they will not be voting for Biden. Traditionally, Muslims have. Muslims, whether they're South Asian, whether they're Middle Eastern, have actually voted for the Democratic Party. But the message I'm getting is that they will not be doing so. And this, of course, as you say, has major repercussions for Joe Biden. The same thing in the UK, elections in the UK in July, early July, and the message is very clear that Muslim British voters, whatever their ethnicity, will actually be very, very hesitant about voting for Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. So there are these two, let's say, Western powers where the impact and the relationship is very direct. Now, in Europe, it's actually much more confusing because I think this issue hasn't been a very strong electoral issue on the continent, if you like, especially not when it comes to the European Parliament, because, the elections to the European Parliament are such a confusing kind of puzzle, who votes for whom and, who actually then ends up having the electoral votes to get into the Parliament. But what we have seen is on the regional level in a country like mine, Belgium, where there were also municipal and regional elections at the same time, people have voted for parties that they felt in Wallonia, in the Brussels area, that they felt were more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. For the first time ever, there will be a Palestinian French MEP, Rima Hassan, who will be in the European Parliament. So there's that's happened as well. And I would say that some of the left leaning parties that have come in and they're second in number in the European Parliament have a more compassionate and a more moral stance when it comes to Palestinians and Gaza especially. But that direct relationship that you're talking about, which we're going to see in the voting in November in the US, and in July in the UK, I cannot see that I have discerned that pattern. But we may see things more clearly in the coming weeks, of course, when we settle down and see exactly who votes in what way in the European Parliament.
Shada, you mentioned the US and the UK, and the EU is kind of a different beast when it comes to the potential electoral impact of Muslim communities and similar minority communities. But there is a significant Muslim population in France, and many of them are citizens who can vote. Do you not see that shaping up in France for this upcoming vote?
So absolutely, France is going to be a test for how Muslims and people of color vote. That's why I think there's a lot of hope among the French citizens I know who are of color or Muslim. There's a lot of hope in the left, a united left stance, a progressive united left stance. But whether that vote, it's only about 7 million French Muslims and a few more million people of color. Whether that vote will be enough, I'm not so sure, because we've seen that the far right has really sort of come in so strongly in France. Macron's party has been basically humbled and humiliated at the polls. So I'm not sure whether that will be enough, but definitely I see French Muslims and people of color voting for the left. That's for sure in France, yes.
Do you think that Macron would be in a position to convince some of these voters, after all that he has done, to join his voters in order to stop the Rassemblement National? I mean, I think it's clearly a different environment than the US, but at the same time, I think that what is really quite interesting is that the kind of people that you would find opposing Macron, people like Éric Zemmour, are deeply Islamophobic. So obviously you have once again this problem of the better of two evils, right? I mean, the question that I continue to have is, given the possibility of, somebody like Zemmour becoming a part of a Rassemblement National coalition, would the Muslim community still not prefer to have somebody like Macron? Although, I mean, granted, this is not a voting bloc, right? I mean, it's not that Muslims vote in bloc, but clearly what we have here is a very strong and very virulent and political antagonist.
So look, in France there are always two rounds, right? 2 rounds of voting. So in the first round, obviously, I do not think that will be the case. But you're right. In the second round, the choice between Macron, who's shown himself to be not very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, or to Muslims, French Muslims, who are in a very, very powerful position in the arts, in politics as well, in business. In the second round, look, who knows what might happen? If that is the case, I would imagine that they would go for, as you said, the lesser of two evils when it comes to relations with Muslim communities and with people of color. But in the first round, I would not imagine that would be the case. So that's going to be the real test. But in the past, we've seen that push comes to shove, people do rally around. And that's what I think Macron's bet is on, that at the last minute, people will realize how high the stakes are and how damning it would be to have a far-right prime minister in France, one of the leading powers in the EU, and will come and vote for his centrists instead. But at this time, I wouldn't guarantee that. Let's see how it plays out once again. We're living in very uncertain times, Martin.
It's really remarkable to imagine that, Macron could be, by default, given another few years to further strengthen the extreme far right. He seems to be the best thing that has ever happened. Actually, I mean, when Macron won against Le Pen in the last round, one of the things that I was happy to point out to France was that I thought that this would actually turn Marine Le Pen into a Godzilla of the far right. But so let me just move on and ask you about the next level, which is the Borrell position. There's been a bit of talk that one of the things, and we mentioned it today in conversation, and it was also mentioned by one of our interlocutors last week, that Meloni, in order to give her blessing to von der Leyen, might try to get somebody from her political orbit into Borrell's position in the next commission. If that were the case, of course, we would see essentially a much, much uglier face of Europe, vis-a-vis, obviously, Gaza, vis-a-vis the countries that are receiving funds from Europe for outsourcing migration policy and so on. What do you see ahead?
So at the moment, what we're hearing, and I think it might be clear very, very soon, just who will get these top positions. So we're talking about, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, I think, getting a second term, 5 years at the head of the EU executive. Costas, the Portuguese ex-prime minister, former prime minister, getting the role of Charles Michel at the head of the EU Council of Ministers, and Kaja Kallas getting the role of the foreign ministry ship, if you like. Look, all of these people, if I may say so, all of these personalities do not inspire me particularly, I have to say. I mean, if I may start with the Commission President, her position on Israel and Gaza has been unrepentantly and unrelentingly pro-Israel, despite the ruling of the International Court of Justice, despite the arrest warrants requested by the International Criminal Court. She has allowed her commissioners to have very high-level talks with Israel. The Human Rights Convention, Human Rights Clause in the EU-Israel agreement has not allowed, and von der Leyen has not allowed that to lead to a suspension of the agreement. Arms exports continue. So her line from the beginning has been very, very pro-Israel. And her comments on the devastation, destruction, the erasure of Palestinians in Gaza have been very muted and I would say without much feeling. So we've got her again for the next 5 years. And these next 5 years are going to be, I think, extremely important in terms of what happens in the Middle East and how this Gaza situation is eventually sorted out. What happens, in terms of Palestinian statehood. So we've got her. I do not know what the new foreign. I mean, in the current setup, if you like, Josep Borrell, who's from the start shown his distance, if you like, from his boss, Ursula von der Leyen, and who's made statements that are actually quite moving and accept that this is a very important issue for the European Union, accepted also that the European Union has been failing on giving its support to what is happening in Gaza. So if somebody of his stature and somebody who believes and looks at the world, not just in terms of Russia, Ukraine, and the very rightful attention we pay to that conflict, but also looks at the world with a wider lens and sees that the global south is increasingly distancing itself from the European Union, and that cannot be relied on in terms of future crises where we will need the votes of the Indias, the Chinas, the Brazils, the South Africas, etc. So we would need, really, I don't want to talk about the personalities. We would need definitely not someone from the far right in charge of European Union foreign policy. I know that national governments are still in charge of foreign policy in many ways. We see that now, you've got Spain, Ireland, Slovenia recognizing Palestinian statehood. Other countries have not. So we're already sort of going off in different directions. But I think if we have a far-right foreign minister, that will be the death knell for European Union foreign policy and whatever standing we still have in the wider world, including in the United Nations. If that happens, I think you can make sure that Europe will lose all influence, role and standing in the world. That it has worked for really hard for the last, 75 years.
Shana, the end of your last answer kind of brings me to my next question, and what I hope will be your next answer, which is this question of Palestinian statehood that several European countries are recognizing and a few other countries are thinking about, while some other European countries, such as Germany, where Mark and I are sitting, are dead set against that for a lot of reasons, some of them more legitimate than others. So we can leave aside questions of the global south and the wider world. There are divisions on this issue right here in the EU. Can you tell us a little bit more from how you see things, and how does the question of Palestinian sovereignty, of Palestinian statehood, and what's happening in Gaza act as a policy and political division inside the European Union?
So at the moment, of course, the 27 EU countries are really deeply divided over the issue of Palestine, Israel, the Middle East more generally, how to move forward. But I've been in this business for some time, and I do remember there was a moment going as far back as 1980 when the European Union actually took a very strong stance and recognized Palestinian, the authority, came out with the two-state solution, was very much part of the Oslo Accords. The European Union was seen as an honest broker. Yes, we were 9 countries then, so it was easier, to unite and rally around us one point of view. So the European Union did have quite a lot of, I would say, goodwill and recognition as an honest broker in the region. All of that over the last few years has been completely, has really rapidly vanished. And we now have 27 countries that are very deeply divided based on their own national history, also their culture. I mean, you see the Irish saying, that they themselves have been colonized by the British so that they recognize what the Palestinians are going through, etc. It's interesting because in the past, I remember France being quite pro-Palestinian in its approach towards I think the term is not pro-Palestinian, but quite accepting the Palestinian issue as being a very important issue and working very hard on the Middle East issues. Spain did that as well. Portugal did that well. And Italy did that as well. So we had some very powerful players, and Germany, to be very frank, did not have the stance that it does have today. It had a more, I would say, impartial, and, was always seen as favoring Israel, of course, but was not so anti-Palestinian as it is today. So the contours of European position on the Middle East have been changing very, very fast. And we see today that there are deep, deep divisions. So moving forward, I don't see how, I don't see these divisions being going away. I think the European Union will remain quite a passive sort of bystander. All I can hope for is that we have policies which are not at the moment, that we do actually take action when it comes to international law. Because you can say what you like about, whether this is collective punishment, whether this is not, whether Israel has its right to defend itself, and, to what extent. All of these, I think, good theoretical discussions to have. But at the moment, you are seeing a daily bombardment. You're seeing the killing, the starving of children. You're seeing really a disproportionate reaction to what was a horrific act by Hamas, for sure. So all of these things, I actually don't see any of these questions being resolved within the European Union. And once again, it will depend as the US, what happens to the United States and what action the United States takes. So the EU's hopes of being a prominent player in the region, I think it should say goodbye to that. And it will not do so under the current circumstances. Whoever becomes the foreign minister, I think is going to be with Ursula von der Leyen leading the commission, the role of the foreign minister or high representative will be very minor. And the EU Council president doesn't really have a role when it comes to foreign policy as well. So the member states I see continuing to bicker and disagree, and leaving the United States and possibly the Arab countries to come to some kind of agreement on a two-state solution or whatever is possible, given just how much blood has been flowing in the last 9 months.
I think we're going to wrap up the conversation, at least for now, unfortunately, with kind of where we began, which was your worries about the far right. But as we've seen, even centrist parties have adopted a lot of right-wing policy points, rhetoric. We almost don't even need the far right to have far right ideas and policies in place. And to this point about Gaza, and to this point about also refugees here and migrants here and other, communities from the outside coming into the EU, and fundamental rights as well. How worried are you, forgetting about the far right, just about what you're hearing from the center of European politics, specifically in Germany, but elsewhere? You don't need the far right. We have the center right supporting, police crackdown on fundamental rights. You have talk about denying intellectual and academic and artistic institutions state money because of their positions and their political opinions. You're seeing a lot of far right and anti-democratic positions coming right out of liberal parties and liberal policymakers. So what do you make of that? And how worried are you about that, let alone the rise of the far right?
So I wrote a piece for The Guardian 2 weeks ago saying I was terrified of what was happening in Europe across the board. And you didn't really need the far right. And you're right to say that many of their positions, whether it's on migration, whether actually also on climate change, or whether it's on, Islamophobia, racism, all of these positions, the hardline stance has been creeping into the body politic, the mainstream body politic of the European Union for the last 7, 8, 9 years. And so this has been a creep. People like me have been warning about it, but, we've all played a role. I'm sorry to say we've all been complicit in allowing this to happen. Obviously, mainstream politicians have thought this was a great way to win votes and, so have really gone and amplified and disseminated, really platformed and hyped up the far right messages. And then, obviously, I would say we've got proof that people like the real thing, rather than the mimic or the imitation. So obviously there's been an increase in the far right vote. But the media also, people have given so much visibility and given so much of a platform to the far right. I mean, I watch Dutch television, I watch French television, Belgian television, obviously also British, and you see how far right leaders, because they're considered charismatic, they're considered to be, good for our sales, good to get viewers on. They're being platformed, and I've been put in very uncomfortable positions where I'm sharing a platform with someone from the far right, and obviously pushing back against what he or she is saying, what they are saying, and then being told afterwards by people, well, we had to get that person on because it's great for our viewership, So the media did that as well, and I think also not actually pushing back in our questions, because far right leaders sort of bask in adoration and admiration, right? And they do not like to be questioned and challenged. And I've seen that in my own life. So we haven't done our job as well. And I think business, I think business and experts and academics, all of us have actually seen this happen and have not cried out in alarm. So the situation we're in today, William, you're absolutely right. And who is going to push back? And, your center right obviously has embraced this with great joy, unfortunately, but the center left also hasn't really stood up and talked about progressive values. They haven't talked about the need to fight racism on a daily basis. They haven't talked about fighting Islamophobia. So we've all sort of been complicit in this, and we're sleepwalking into a disaster. So am I worried? I'm terrified.
All right. Well, we normally don't like to end things on terror and fear, but we will leave it there for now. But hopefully we can have you back for maybe a more uplifting, or maybe a more, I don't know, take it from a different angle.
I can give you I can give you a more uplifting end.
Sure. Go for it.
I do think that, once we've sort of been through this moment, that we will wake up. I think, this has been, these elections have been a very strong wake-up call. And I'm really, really hoping, whether it's in France, whether it's in Germany, whether it's here in the European Parliament, that our progressive forces that believe in an inclusive and open and forward-looking Europe will come together and come together and push back with a new narrative, which is a narrative of inclusion, and make sure that people of all nationalities, ethnicities, race, religion feel at home in Europe. Because seriously, this is our home. We have nowhere else to go. Europe is our home as well. This is where we belong.
That's it for this week's Euroscopic, written by us, produced by us, and edited by Martin. You can catch us every week either at our Substack, euroscopic.substack.com, or on euobserver.com. Of course, we would love to hear from you, so be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts. Many thanks today to Shada Islam and Valentina Saini for joining us with their insights from Italy and around the European Union. Till next time, I'm William Glucroft.
And I am Martin Gak.
Thanks so much for listening.